All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. From our Southern Fire Exchange team today, I'm joined by Laurel Kays from North Carolina State University and Marianelle Armstrong from the University of Florida. We're really excited about our webinar today, and I'm glad you're here. First, we'll have a research presentation by Dr. Ben Poulter and Dr. Morgan Varner from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and Tall Timbers Research Station. Dr. Poulter and Dr. Varner will be discussing their research quantifying the spatial and temporal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on prescribed fire use in the southeastern U.S. Following their presentation, I'm excited that we'll be featuring a panel discussion with 3 experienced wildland fire managers representing different agencies. Mr. Brett Williams with the U.S. Air Force Wildland Fire Branch, Mr. Sasha Ernst with the Florida Park Service, and Mr. Greg Titus with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will talk about how their prescribed fire management programs have adapted to burning during the ongoing pandemic. Following their discussion, there'll be time for you to submit your questions for the panelists. We've had some great conversations leading up to today with this team, and I'm pleased that we're able to bring all of these speakers together to share their experiences and lessons with you. I would like to take just a quick moment to share a bit of information about our program, the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast. We're a collaborative among the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, NC State University, and the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. We're sponsored by the federally funded Joint Fire Science Program, and we're the southeastern branch of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network. Working with our network of partners, we develop programs, opportunities, and events that bridge the divide between the fire science and natural resource management communities. We have over 70 of our past fire science and management webinars like this one recorded and posted to our YouTube webinar archive. So if you are interested, these are great resources for your professional development, for RT130 refresher courses, and online classes. And finally, if you're joining us today from an area outside of the southeastern US, please look into connecting with your local Fire Science Exchange network. These are the folks that are working to connect regional managers and researchers to address local fire science issues and make differences on the ground. You can visit firescience.gov for more information. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce our first 2 speakers today. Ben Poulter is a research scientist in the Earth Sciences Division at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. He combines ecosystem modeling with satellite observations to study how vegetation is responding to climate change, changes in atmospheric composition, disturbance, and management. He received his Ph.D. in 2005 from Duke University, where he studied how fire and sea level rise affected the die-off of coastal forests and precocins in North Carolina. He contributed to the 5th and 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Reports, and currently serves on the Science Leadership Group of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program's North American Carbon Program. Welcome, Ben. Our next speaker, Morgan Varner, is the Director of Fire Research at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. Dr. Varner coordinates Tall Timbers' local to international collaborations aimed at improving the understanding of fire behavior and predictions of fire effects on plants and animals. Prior to joining Tall Timbers, Morgan was the team leader and a research scientist at the Pacific Wildland Fire Science Lab with the U.S. Forest Service in Seattle, Washington. He has also been on the faculty of Mississippi State University, Virginia Tech, and Humboldt State University. And from 2014 to 2016, Morgan was the chair of the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils. Morgan has a Ph.D. in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida, and an MS in forestry from Auburn University, and a BS in forest resources from the University of Idaho. So welcome, Ben, and welcome, Morgan. We're glad to have you with us today. Thank you so much, everybody who has provided an introduction on the chat window. Looking forward to it. And just one moment, everybody, as we trade out presentations and get things rolling.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks to the Southern Fire Exchange for hosting this webinar. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to listen to the story of how COVID-19 has affected the 2020 prescribed fire season. This is as much of sort of a one-way as it is a two-way conversation that we would really like to have with managers. And we're very keen to listen and learn about the sort of underground experiences that people have had over the past year and unfortunately continue to have. And so we'll be presenting what we know from the satellite record over the past 12 months, linking that with some of the statistics and reporting that we have from the federal agencies. But again, we're very keen to sort of hear people's personal experiences. And I'd also just like to sort of acknowledge up front sort of the impact that COVID-19 has had on people's personal lives. It's been a pretty terrible year for most of us, and in addition to having this impact on personal livelihoods, that there's been this signature that we've been looking at from an Earth system perspective. So this work has been done in collaboration with Morgan Varner and Joe Noble and Eli Simonson at Toll Timbers, with Patrick Freeborn and Matt Jolly at the U.S. Forest Service Fire Science Lab, and with Carlos Gaitan and Chris Lund at Benchmark Labs. So 2020 fire featured quite prominently in the news, in addition to the pandemic news. And there's really two tales of fire that the US experienced. The first is on the left, where we can see in the green line the cumulative number of active fires recorded for the state of California, where over 4 million acres burned in 2020. I think around 5 of the largest fires since the 1930s were recorded in 2020. And this really dominated much of the headlines. In contrast, in the Southeast, there's a very different story going on with active fires. And you can see in the green line here that the total number of active fires on week 52 was week 50, showing a dramatic decrease compared to the past 20 years or so. And this is what we want to focus on in this presentation. Early on in the pandemic, various theories were developed to try to understand how COVID-19 might affect the Earth system. This is some work from the group of Noah Diffenbaugh and colleagues showing COVID at the top here. And we could have indirect effects of COVID affecting on the Earth system, affecting human health, which would then affect economic activity and potentially impact ecosystems and fossil fuel emissions. Or we have the direct effect of COVID-19 on reduced mobility, the effect of reduced mobility on transportation emissions, how this feeds back into aerosol forcing and cloud condensation nuclei, and how this would affect local to regional climates, and then this feedback into natural and managed ecosystems. What the study didn't highlight was the direct connection that humans have with wildfire and prescribed fire, and so this is what we were interested in trying to track as part of this framework. Also early on, the satellite observations that we're making for atmospheric CO2 concentrations, as well as for air pollution, showed fairly rapid responses to the economic impacts of the COVID-19 shutdowns. The figure on the left shows in the blue color a decline in the expected CO2 concentration increase over Asia, which coincided quite closely to when the economic impacts of COVID hit in that region. And then later in the year, as the US began to shut down, we also saw corresponding declines in the expected growth of atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And so I say expected because globally atmospheric CO2 concentrations increased again in 2020. But in particular parts of the globe, the increase at that particular time of year wasn't as much as we would have expected based on the historical trajectories. On the right-hand side, we can see reductions in NO2 on nitrogen dioxide. This is a trace gas that's emitted through incomplete combustion of oil and gas. And so on the left, we can see sort of the historical concentrations of NOx over the period of 2015 to 2019. And then on the right, we can see that there was up to a 30% decline in NOx concentrations due to reductions in transportation related to COVID-19 shutdowns. A lot of this work is documented currently on the NASA COVID-19 dashboard, and you're welcome to explore some of these additional studies, and the results that we're presenting today are also archived on this website. So we became interested in how COVID-19 would affect managed fires. In the US, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, people ignite more than 80% of the fires, and these fires are responsible for more than 40% of the burned area in the US. The pyrome of the Southeastern United States is defined by having intermediate, cool, and small fires, but these are known to be heavily influenced by human activities. And so the figure on the right, the top panel shows the proportion of fires that are influenced by humans. The bottom figure shows in blue the pyrome that the southeastern ecosystems generally fall within, and you can see that these are mostly impacted by human activities. We began having informal conversations with practitioners and managers who were telling us early in 2020 that their fire programs were closing due to worker safety, but also due to air quality concerns, where managers wanted to mitigate the effect that air pollution might have in exacerbating COVID-19 symptoms. And so in March 2020, we began tracking active fires using data from NASA's Fire Information for Resource Management System, or FIRMS, and we received funding from NASA's Rapid Response Program to put together this analysis. So as a NASA scientist, we often show this figure of NASA's Earth Science observing fleet, and each of the names corresponds to a different satellite mission that is either operational or is in some planning stage, but going through the mission life cycle. And highlighted in red here are some of the main satellites that we use to observe fires from space, either through detecting heat anomalies or through looking at the surface reflectance properties and how those change following a fire. Just briefly, these satellites are telling us very different things. The figure on the right shows the mid-infrared to thermal infrared wavelengths, which we use to detect the heat anomalies. And while we have a range of satellites, so each row here is a different satellite measuring different regions of the mid to thermal infrared emissivities, only a couple of these can measure fire temperatures or temperatures that are related to fire. And this is based largely on the theory of the Planck's black body function and linking the emissivities to surface temperatures. Another sort of limitation that we have is the time of day that the satellite is passing over a particular location. And so this figure shows time on the x-axis, and so we have daytime around this section here. So at 10:30, you can see that there's two satellites that make an overpass in the morning. And then we have another set of satellites making an overpass around 1:30 in the afternoon. And then we have a gap in satellite-based observations of heat anomalies. And this is the size of the flame here sort of indicates when those fires are most active. And so these sorts of analyses really need to take into account sort of the limitations we have in the observing network. So we began tracking simply the number of active fires, and we used two active fire data sets, one coming from the VIIRS instrument on the SUMI satellite, and then the other instruments, Aqua and Terra, aboard the other instruments, MODIS, aboard the Aqua and Terra satellites. And so we tried to sort of mitigate some of the uncertainty in the observations by using several different instruments. And then we were interested in understanding what the drivers were behind the trends and sort of disentangling some of the meteorological events that happened in 2020 so that we could more clearly understand the COVID-19 signal. And then we use this information in a preliminary analysis that's ongoing to try to help to identify areas that were not burned in 2020 and to use forecasts going out 9 months to be able to try to prioritize where these fires should take place in the future, given what we know about future prescribed fire burn windows. So here's sort of one of the key results to the analysis. We found in April 2020 up to a 50% decrease in active fires on public lands. And so the map on the left is showing the anomalies of active fires relative to the past 20 years. In red, we're seeing increases in fire, and then in blue, we're seeing decreases in fire. And so the map is sort of dominated mostly by blue color, but definitely with some land regions and ownership patterns emerging where fires were still taking place. On the right, we show just the lands that are federally managed, and we can see a consistent decline in the number of active fires in April 2020 relative to the past 20 years average. So to look at this in another way, on the private lands, we at the end of the year, we saw roughly a 21% decrease in the number of active fires on both private and public lands. And then again, we see that almost a doubling in the decrease when we just track federal lands. By state, on both the public and private lands, the reduction in active fires was greatest in South Carolina and Tennessee and Mississippi, ranging from a 37 to 28% reduction. And then Florida and Alabama on private and public lands had the lowest decrease in the number of active fires detected. And then looking at just the federally owned lands, we see that in Georgia, there was up to a 70% reduction in the number of active fires. Tennessee had almost a 60% decline in active fires, South Carolina 50%, and so on, with Mississippi having sort of the lowest decline of around 21%. So looking more closely at when the decline of active fires began, we noticed that the decline on all lands actually began in February. So this took place before the COVID-19 shutdowns began. And when we look at the federal lands, it's the same story, that we see the decline in active fires actually happening before the shutdown. And then as we sort of continue across the time series, so the blue colors are indicating a decline in fire, the yellow to red colors are indicating an increase in the number of active fires detected. We see sort of a general trend on all lands toward decreased numbers of active fires relative to the historical record. On the federal lands, the story is slightly more extreme. We see that in March, there's slightly less negative anomalies. So there was still less fire, but slightly less than what was in February. But then in April, we see that these reductions in active fires became quite severe and were sustained pretty much throughout the rest of the growing season, the fire season and the growing season. So these are monthly anomalies, and so we can look at these in higher temporal resolution. So we can look at the weekly anomalies, and again on all lands we see this February decrease, and then toward the end of February, early March, we start to see some positive anomalies. So we see that the active fires is sort of coming back. So fire management is coming back after after what the event was in February that caused the decline. And then we start to see more negative anomalies on all lands, but this is more extreme on the panel on the lower right, where we see a more sustained blue color throughout the year, indicating a decrease in active fires. And so we looked at the role of weather in the active fire decline, and we were aware of this at the time, and so putting this in the context of the past calendar year, we can see that there was a strong cold front on February 5th and 6th, which brought a lot of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico over the southeastern US. And so the figure on the far left indicates that precipitation anomaly impacting most of the states that we were tracking the active fires for. Through March and April, we still had some positive precipitation anomalies, so it's wetter than usual. But in some areas, like in the Carolinas, for example, and Florida, parts of southern Georgia and Alabama, we see sort of a return to precipitation normals. And so we really have to take into account what was taking place in February to interpret the COVID-19 signal. When we look at the precipitation over the last 12 months, we do see sort of opportunities where there were dry spells that would have facilitated prescribed fire to take place. Alabama is sort of the most extreme example, where we do see that February 5th and 6th storm event in the weekly time series. But then we see this sort of return to normals, which would have made conditions suitable for prescribed fires to take place. And then looking at the KBDI, the Heat Fire and Drought Index, I think we get a better sense of the actual meteorological conditions that were driving fire behaviors and active fires at this time, compared to looking at precipitation. That is a record of both extremes in wetness and extremes in dryness. And so the KBDI, the figure on the left, indicates the just the absolute KBDI for March, April, May, compared to the long-term mean. And we can see that the KBDI visually isn't terribly different, despite there being this large storm event in February. And then the difference between the two, if you just focus on the Southeastern United States, we can generally see that these pale blue colors indicate that there's not really a significant departure of the KBDI for last March, April, and May compared to the historical record. It's slightly drier in Florida at that time, but it's not significantly wetter, and so this is unlikely to have caused a substantial effect on COVID-19 impact on active fires throughout the remainder of the fire season. Another way to look at this is through trying to predict the number of active fires that you would expect for a given precipitation. And so we were interested in whether we could develop a very simple statistical model that looked at annual precipitation and the number of annual active fires, with the hypothesis being that 2020, so the filled circles, would show a departure from the predicted relationship between precipitation and the number of active fires. And so this figure is showing that you could actually predict the number of active fires based on a given precipitation, based on annual precip. And then if we look at the precip that's taking place during March and April, which is generally the time when most of the active fires are being documented in the Southeast, we do start to see a couple of departures. But again, using total precipitation isn't the best integrative measure of predicting the occurrence of fire. And so we looked at, again, what the KBDI index would tell us about this relationship. with the hypothesis being that we could predict the number of active fires based on the KBDI, and we start to see this departure of the 2020 fire season to what we would have predicted more clearly. And so for all lands, this red bar shows the departure of the 2020 active fires to what would have been predicted based on what the KBDI tells us about active fires. And then the green bar indicates the departure of the number of active fires for 2020 just for federal lands. And when we match these up to the total number of active fires and their anomalies from the previous slides, we see that we can explain this departure from this very simple statistical relationship. Another question that we had throughout this was whether the satellites were telling us about wildfires or managed fires, and so it's obviously not possible to tell sort of the cause of an active fire from a satellite without carrying out further analysis. And so we went to the Integrated Interagency Fuels Treatment Database, the IAFT, where there are statistical reports and geospatial information on different types of fires, including wildfire as well as managed fires. And so what we see here is, again, the month on the x-axis and the number of acres treated on the y-axis. And this is the end of the year on the right-hand side, and telling you basically the cumulative number of acres that were treated since 2011. And so immediately you can see 2020 emerging as being anomalous to the mean number of acres that have been treated over the past 10 years. And we see this the storm feature emerge. So early February was the storm, and we see that the number of treated acres is somewhat anomalous. It's quite low. But then following the storm, when the conditions improved, we can see that the number of treated acres increased rapidly. And right before the COVID-19 shutdowns, we were sort of tracking the best year to date. And then March 15 is roughly when the programs shut down their prescribed fire activities. And then you can see that the trajectory to the cumulative number of acres treated sort of went flatlined. And then this just indicates the number of treated acres. And we're pretty much on the lowest in the last 10 years. And then another interesting feature from this analysis is the impact of the federal government shutdown in 2019, which lasted from the end of December 2018 through the end of January 2019, and you can see that there is already this fairly steep decline, a record decline in the number of acres treated. But that the agencies were generally able to catch up throughout the year. Looking at this in more detail by comparing the active fires from the satellites with the statistics, we see some good agreement. And so this is just an example for Louisiana, where again we see the decline in active fires from the storm event, followed by this rapid increase in active fires that corresponds to a rapid increase in the number of acres that are being treated through prescribed fire programs, and then followed by this flat feature, which indicates the impact of COVID-19 on prescribed fires. So to summarize, we see relative to the past 20 years, we see a 21% decline in active fires for all lands, so public and private, which is the third lowest number of active fires over the past 20 years. For federal lands alone, we see that this was the lowest year on record for the number of active fires, with a 41% decline. If we go to a shorter time record, so now we're looking at the VIIRS active fires. So VIIRS has only been in orbit since 2012. We see a similar sort of departure from the historical record. So 2020 was the second lowest number of fires compared to the past 10 years or so. But for federal lands, it was still the lowest number of fires recorded. So by state, again, Georgia had the largest decrease on federal lands to 68%, and South Carolina had a decrease of 37% on all lands. Whereas in Florida, we see a decrease of about 21% on federal lands and 6% on all lands. The satellite detections agreed very well with the IAFT database, which provide good evidence that what we're seeing from the satellites is really the managed fires and changes in managed fires. Morgan will talk to this in a minute from now, but we did see very opportunistic use of burn windows, particularly by private and state landowners, where when the conditions were appropriate, people were getting out there and carrying out the prescribed burns. And there's some interesting features emerging for growing season fires that where we're seeing higher increase in active fires in the growing season compared to the historical record. I think that the satellite data have been remarkable in being able to track the changes in active fires. And we still need to sort of keep into consideration the time of day that the satellites are making these overpasses. There were some issues with one of the satellites, the Aqua satellite, where there was a problem getting data down during August, and so we need to sort of increase the redundancy of fire-based missions and other features. So what are the implications of these decreased active fires? We were interested going into this, trying to link this work to some of the air quality impacts to see whether the decline in trace gas emissions from fires was leading to an improvement in air quality. And then we were also interested in sort of what the consequences would be by missing the opportunity to burn in 2020 on biodiversity, ecosystem structure, and composition. The figures on the bottom are simply showing further evidence that that there was a decline in fires in the Southeast, and this is just simply looking at the carbon emissions for the entire region, and this is monthly carbon emissions. So you can see we sort of have this decrease in April, which is anomalous to the previous years, and we can look at the total number of carbon emissions throughout the year, with 2020 tracking the lowest emissions on record. And then we can also look at more direct measures of air quality. This is looking at the aerosol optical depth, which integrates things like PM 2.5 and black carbon. And here I'm just showing a time series for urban areas with 2020 in red, and then the past 40 years of AOD in gray, and you can ignore the green and purple for now. But what we can generally see is that 2020 was tracking some of the lowest AOD concentrations on record. And so this is partly due to long-term trends in AOD over this time period. So it's been a decline in AOD, but it's also sort of magnified by the fact that there was less burning taking place. So taking this to the next level, we also use some of NASA's air pollution satellites, in this case, the ozone monitoring instrument, OMI, to look at carbon monoxide concentrations to see whether we could detect an impact on carbon monoxide. But the story is slightly complex, partly because a lot of that CO is coming from fossil fuel and background biogenic VOC emissions. And so, so there's more work to be done there. And then the implications in terms of looking forward. We've been working with seasonal forecasting data from NASA's GEOS program. And these are just some examples of how we can forecast out the KBDI index, with the idea being that if we could combine this sort of meteorological forecast information with fire history information, we could perhaps have a more informed approach to prioritizing where fire should be taking place within these burn windows that might be getting shorter in the future. And so now I'll turn it over to Morgan.
Thanks, Ben. And really, in summary, I hope that's not too depressing, because it's awfully depressing. A lot of things about COVID are, clearly for a lot of regions, not everywhere, and certainly not across ownerships, but for a lot of regions, 2020 was terrible, and for federal lands, it followed a very difficult 2019. And we had originally planned to show some preliminary research or results on this in October, and then it was November and then December as we started to accumulate it. And now we've wrapped around into the 2021 fire year. And if you look at that graph on the right, according to permit data and with corroboration from satellite data, January, February, March, and we're about a month away from something like 50% of all the typical burned area per year in Florida. And so COVID-19 has certainly had an effect in 20 and continues to have an effect in 21. And given these ecosystems, I think it's an interesting question and something we'll come to in the panel, thinking about how it complicates future burning. One of the interesting things about it in those patterns in 2020, if you remember some of those plots that Ben showed, is the sort of opportunism that really defines prescribed fire managers, from the every day is a burn day attitude and mantra, to really starting to look at growing season burns in places where it's been planned and thought about, for a couple decades, where we really saw a lot of change this year. Next slide, Ben. And obviously the species that you're all managing are sensitive to fire return interval. Many of these species have certainly a sub-decade fire return interval. Many of them have a couple years. The Red Hills, where Tall Timbers is located, tends to burn on a biennial basis. And the complications from COVID clearly will affect these species beyond the obvious wildfire hazard reduction issues. Next slide. So if we were at a meeting together in a non-COVID world, we would be able to have quite a bit of interaction with you after this. And we understand that this makes things difficult. And so there are a couple of things I think that are worth thinking about from an interaction standpoint. One is we set up an email address today, this fireresearch@talltimbers.org. And I think David will show that again later. If you have anecdotes from how COVID affected your prescribed fire management program, please send them. Sometimes it seems like your own individual story is, you may think of it as inconsequential or it's just a single data point. But in total, taking those individual anecdotes and putting them together really starts to create a more rich story. Did these results fit what you observed? Were there some anomalies that you didn't see us present? I think that helps us in this time where we can't communicate so easily. So please do that. And if you're interested in looking at these patterns by state, and then being able to contrast the federal versus private land, that there are some issues with a couple of these things, but the website there on the right that Laurel also just included in the chat has a viewer that you can look at current by state across the country and differentiate between those land uses. Okay. And with that, David, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, Morgan, thank you. And thank you, Ben, for your presentations. Once again, if you all joined us while they were presenting, my name is David Godwin. I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. And we just had a research presentation from Dr. Ben Poulter and Dr. Morgan Varner from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and Tall Timbers Research Station. At this point in our program, we would like to provide an opportunity for you to ask questions. So you can type your questions and comments for our speakers in the Q&A window in Zoom, and we'll try to get through them with the time we have available. One feature that we would like you to try and use in Q&A is the thumbs up option. And so if you see other questions that you would like us to try and get to in the time that we have available here, please give them a thumbs up, a vote essentially, and that'll help us to prioritize getting through those questions. So one of the first things, one of the questions that I saw that came in from Mark, and Mark asked, are you able to tease apart the prescribed fire that are being observed on state lands versus private lands? Mark says he would hypothesize that private lands might have shown less of a decrease in burn activity due to a lack of restrictions with not being associated with a government agency at the state level. So would you all like to comment on that?
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I'll turn. I mean, from the remote sensing point of view, we should do this, and we should tease out sort of the state land impact. But I'll let Morgan talk a bit more about some of the private land issues that he experienced.
Yeah, I think, for all of us, on a topic like this, you all know the timeline of a topic like this. It all started 11 months ago, just, among the other COVID challenges. And one of the things that we'd like to get to that I think a few of the chat questions and a couple of the Q&A comments get to is being able to overlay permit records. And it's always been, what Ben showed was multiple lines of evidence showing the database for fuels treatments, the 2 different satellites, and another form of evidence is to take state level permit data. And I think that's a way we can get at some of the further differentiation of lands by landowner type, which is clearly an issue. And we know that the federal agencies were facing their own challenges, but I think some of the other differences, both in space and by land ownership, will be really interesting to look at.
There's another question that came in from Barbara. Barbara asked that, or comments that in Florida, they were told they would not be granted a burn permit because they were in an urban interface and due to COVID. Could either of you talk about, are you aware of studies that demonstrate connections between smoke impacts and people who have COVID?
I'm not. I think it's going to come up when we talk in the manager panel, because I know that was a major issue. There was certainly the, reducing burning because of potential contact, but also it was to not be a burden on society, whether that's real or perceived. But I don't know anything more than that. There are actually a couple people that are tuning in who are experts in it.
I'm not. I think that there are definitely studies that have looked at the connection. I can't remember any off the top of my head, but I can post something. During the discussion.
Yeah, I think that that may provide an idea for a follow-up webinar after this one coming up later this year, and we will look into seeing if we can pull some folks together, maybe from EPA and other outfits to do a follow-up webinar specifically on that topic and how it relates to the Southeast. So I'm thankful for that comment, Barbara, and appreciate you sharing that with us. And I think that will be something we work on with our program. We had a comment that came in about Talat asked about the difference between federal and prescribed burning as it related to Georgia. He says, why do you think there was such a big difference between the federal and private land burning declines, so the reductions in Georgia, 68% versus 11%?
Georgia doesn't have a ton of federal land, for one. You saw Fort Stewart really stick out. I don't know if we can jump and if Brett knows any more detail The DoD was they had an interesting response to it, and I think he'll talk about that a little bit more, Talat. But I think in the states without a ton of federal land, using satellites is a little more challenging.
And Ben, you had an interesting slide at the beginning of your presentation where you showed the timing of the satellite overpasses and how that relates to the frequency of fire on the landscape, and really thinking about it in terms of the timing of prescribed burns over the course of a day. Do you know, looking ahead, are there any projects that might change that overpass time? Yep, that's it. In terms of satellites to help us to differentiate and detect more fires during the peak burn periods? I think you're muted there. Let's see. Hey, Ben, can you hear? You're muted.
Sorry. Okay, so I was saying this is the area, the peak burn window, where we don't have any satellite overpasses for fire detection, but that we know that fire is taking place and quite active. One set of satellites that I didn't mention is the geostationary satellites. So these satellites just sit on the same location, and the latest generation of those is taking images every 5 minutes or so, and so so they're producing sort of remarkable time series. The problem is that the spatial resolution of those is around 1 kilometer up to 5 kilometers the further you get away from the from viewing directly from space to the location underneath. So geostationary is an option, but then there are other missions in development that would try to fill this gap, and I'm happy to connect folks with people designing those.
And from a prescribed fire standpoint, this matters much more for wildfire than it does for prescribed fire. That the time of those satellites tends to overlap pretty well with typical burning. Obviously, not night burning or burning that's late in the evening, but those tend to be more exceptions than rules.
You mentioned the spatial resolution of detection. That leads into a question that came in, and I'm not sure if you guys looked at this at all or you have a sense of it, but could you tell if the size of burns changed over the study period?
That's a great question. We focused this analysis on the active fires, so just detecting those heat anomalies. Eventually, we'd like to extend the analysis to looking at burned area. The challenge there is that there's with MODIS, for example, so it's they develop a 1 kilometer burned area product. But there's about a 2-month sort of lag between when that becomes available, and 1 kilometer resolution might be too coarse. And then we could look at Landsat, the monitoring trends in burn severity database, but that currently ends, I think, at the end of 2018. And that's 30-meter resolution. So that would be sort of the data set you'd want to do this with.
I know that topic's going to come up in the panel. And I feel like if people, the chat here could blow up, but I feel like if people have their own observations of that, because I've heard in the COVID time, I've heard both ends of that spectrum. I've heard a lot of examples of folks that were enlarging units because they knew they had fewer days. I've also heard of folks saying we had to pick marginal days, and given other restrictions, we were only allowed to have this as, X as a ceiling for the size of our units. And I think those are really interesting because you're all so diverse. I think you all have very different experiences. And if you do respond to that fire research at talltimbers.org, I think that's a really cool topic.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben and Morgan, for your presentations. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. We're going to switch gears right here and introduce our panelists. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for getting through their responses and their perspectives from working over the past year and their thoughts about the future. So let's see. Brett, if I can get you to turn on your camera in just a minute, we'll add you to the spotlight. So first of all, let me introduce our panel speaker. Sasha Ernst is the Fire Management Program Coordinator for the Florida Park Service. Driven by a passion to keep good fire on the ground, he is the current chair of the North Florida Prescribed Fire Council and the incident commander for the Southern Area Engine Academy. Prior to his return home to his Florida roots, he spent 15 years in prescribed fire, wildland fire, and fuels management with the National Park Service. Greg Titus is the Zone Fire Management Officer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for North Florida and Alabama. Greg attended Florida State University and received a BS in Biological Sciences. Greg's first prescribed fire was in 1984 as an employee with the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission. He then went to work for the U.S. Forest Service on the Apalachicola National Forest in 1985, working in many different positions: biotech, timber marker, wildlife biologist, and fire planner. In 2007, after 22 years with the U.S. Forest Service, Greg moved on to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge as the Zone Fire Management Officer for the North Florida and Alabama refuges. Greg is a member of the Southern Area Incident Management Red Team as a fire behavior analyst. And last but not least, Brett Williams is the Eglin Wildland Support Module Lead, Eglin Air Force Base Wildland Support Module with the Air Force Wildland Fire Branch in Niceville, Florida. After graduating from Stephen F. Austin State University in East Texas with a BS in Environmental Science and an MS in Forest Science, Brett served in the U.S. Peace Corps as a park specialist for the National Park System in Mongolia from 2001 to 2003. Upon his return, Brett was a conservation team leader for the Nature Conservancy's Gulf Coastal Plain Ecosystem Partnership in Northwest Florida. From 2007 to 2016, he was the fire ecologist at Eglin Air Force Base in Niceville, Florida. And in this role, he was responsible for landscape level prescribed fire planning, implementation, ecological and fire effects monitoring, and fire research coordination across the 464,000 acre Eglin Reservation. Brett currently serves as the module lead for the Air Force Wildland Fire Branch, Eglin Wildland Support Module at Eglin Air Force Base, and is responsible for managing an average of 90,000 acres of prescribed fire and 75 wildfires per year. So welcome, Sasha, Greg, and Brett. We are excited to have you here with us today. Appreciate you taking the time. So we're now going to go through some discussion questions with our panelists to learn about their experiences managing prescribed fire programs over the past year. After we wrap up the discussion questions, we'll move into an audience Q&A. So if you have questions for the panelists, at any time you can go ahead, just like we did for the first presentation, and put those questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom. And we'll try to get to the questions with the most votes in the time that we have remaining at the end of our program today. So with that, everyone, let's get on to our questions. So first, this question first for you, Sasha. Could you talk about how COVID-19 has impacted your 2020 prescribed fire programs?
Well, good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. So for most of us, it's had a dramatic effect, and how you look at that could be taken multiple different ways. One of the main things is it made us reevaluate a lot of the different things we take for granted, like training, how we're going to do that to get people on the fire line, moving away from in-person stuff to, move to virtual. And that was a big challenge for us. But also on the fire line, all the changing safety protocols, we've had to be very adaptive and, take on new roles and trying to keep everyone safe, distance, multiple vehicles, kind of everyone became more of a safety officer than they already were. It added extra things to everybody's plate. So that was a very significant part of it. in general. But it also made us prioritize what we could accomplish and when. You know, for the beginning of this, when it popped up in March, we basically, from March through June, our main core fire season for a lot of our growing season or spring season fires, which is where we've been aiming to get to for ecological benefits over the last decade, moving into that late growing or late spring growing season. That was right when COVID hit. So it was really hard for us to get folks together. As an agency, we were still defining some of our protocols. So we were, you know, at a deficit for what we accomplished. Last year, we hit probably about 60% of what we were aiming for. We usually try and get around 90,000 acres, and we were a little over 40. So it was a significant hit. And we go on a fiscal year that ends in July or ends in June, begins again in July. But that core season, we were really at a deficit from, you know, an average of about 45,000 acres to about 26,000 acres from March to June. And so, you know, it shows it's going to create some backlog for us, but we also got, you know, some fire on the ground when some agencies weren't able to do that. So I feel like we had some success. We've learned a lot, but it was a challenge for sure, probably like most of you.
All right, Greg, would you like to add on at St. Mark's, you know, and across your refuges, how has COVID-19 impacted your 2020 prescribed fire programs? You're muted there. Hey, Greg, we have you on mute.
There we go. How's that?
Yep, sounds good.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel today. And I'll speak specifically about St. Mark's Refuge. That's where the majority of the prescribed fire program occurs in the zone. So very similar to Sasha, we were on COVID quarantine from March through the first part of May. So very little burning, no burning done in that time frame. Then when we did come back to work mid-May, we had to develop protocols to deal with COVID, you know, isolation in vehicles. We separated, we worked in small modules and really changed our mode, our operational mode. But we were able to come back pretty strong in our growing season. So we had a really record year of growing season burning for us. But what that's done, it's created almost a bimodal system of fuels. We have a huge backlog on our older roughs that we weren't able to get to, but now we've also got a very large amount that's been burned in the growing season. So it's really shifted our fuels, the rough or the age of our fuel loads out on the refuge. And I'll discuss more in some of our coming questions on how we were able to accomplish that large amount of growing season burning, but it has impacted our program overall.
All right, and Brett, would you like to talk about your experience there at Eglin?
Yeah, and I'll mainly talk about Eglin just because I also manage Tyndall Air Force Base, but Hurricane Michael complicates the picture there, the impacts from that. But as Morgan alluded to, the Air Force never officially shut down operations for prescribed burning, but they left it to each module lead or manager to determine that on a site-by-site or base-by-base basis. But most of our partners are other state and federal agencies. There's actually very few Air Force employees that are wildland firefighters. So I voluntarily shut down both because of concern about firefighter health and safety, but also the societal burden that Morgan talked about. And there's about 5 hospitals within 5 miles of Eglin Air Force Base. So just decided it's the right thing to do. But I think we had an advantage that Greg didn't have. We stayed at work and were able to keep planning, keep making some progress, prep, so forth. Even with that, we had about a 20% decline in acres. We average 85,000 acres per year over the last 10 years. And we got 60,000 last year. Again, similar to Greg, a lot of that in the growing season as we made up time in May. As far as ecosystem conditions, as far as losing those acres, it's hard to tell in a 1-year time frame, but as long as we can adapt and overcome, which is what luckily firefighters are good, we're built to adapt and overcome and to deal with risk management. So I think most of us are already adapting to this, but remains to be seen kind of going into the future, how well we'll be able to keep adapting with new variants and so forth, further complexity.
All right, thank you. We appreciate that. So if you all have questions for them, you can go ahead and type that into the Q&A. We'll get on to our next question. And Greg, could you talk about what strategies your program has used to burn during the pandemic? Do you have any success stories that you'd like to share?
Well, one of the things we've done is we were fortunate that we were set up from previous years of burning. So we had plenty of areas that were available for growing season burning, because we're generally only burning things with a 3 year rough or less in the growing season. So we had set ourselves up well by having successful program in the past. We had a lot of areas that were available. One of the other things we did, we looked at large blocks, combining units that we could burn with a minimal number of staff to reduce, our exposure. And we also were able to take advantage of having an agency helicopter available. So combining those things, we were really able to up our growing season acreage. And without getting into more of some of the coming questions, I'll stop right there.
All right, Brett, would you like to talk about, did y'all have strategies in your area over in the Panhandle?
Yeah, we did. We did all the typical social distancing, mask wearing, cleaning surfaces, but kind of summarize all that. I think it's important to create a culture of safety, a culture of being concerned about your crewmates, about those incoming resources. And that's really what the key is it's really tough to change a habit, I've found, and to do it consistently. And so just creating that culture. We went to shift schedules. That's really helped. We kind of the success story. We've had 2 different exposures on the crew and had to quarantine at various times. And both times they were isolated to a single shift or a air crew. So we were able to isolate that exposure and only lose part of our staff instead of the whole crew. And then the other thing I've found that really useful is creating what I call pods or bubbles within a burn team. So for a weekend, let's say you're doing a weekend burn campaign, keep the same air crew the whole weekend. Keep the same divisions if you're using divisions the whole weekend. Keep like resources together. If you have partners coming in, we use the Longleaf Alliance. We try to keep the Longleaf Alliance together. So if we get an exposure, it's not as widespread. And then just social distancing and working with the crew. We tried to use, or we think a lot about the module as one concept, but it doesn't work as well for a crew that goes home to their family every night or goes out to dinner. But that's a concept out west that was used of just stay within your module and don't interact as much with folks outside your module or crew.
All right, Sasha, could you talk about, are there strategies that your program has put in place this year?
So a lot of what Brett was saying and Greg said, we definitely focused on, we have teams that come together for our burns. A lot of our burners are actually not primary fire. Most of our folks are rangers and interpretive staff, even administrative staff that come out to help us get the burns done. But we use the pod concept to where if people were coming from the same park to support another park, we tried to keep vehicles together and things like that, so that once they hit the fire line, it was still that little group of folks working together again to make if there was a transmission, to make tracking that a little more easy and accessible. Because once you have everybody together, if you start mixing the trucks that they came in and stuff, it just makes it a logistical nightmare to get through if you do have an exposure. So that the pod concept really did help, and I think it took off and has been something we've used, including when we've responded to wildfires. Bringing that group stays together, eats together, and that's how that you're in as safe of an environment as you can without overexposure. Another thing we did for a strategy of success was just try and look at some of the windows. We had limits of what we could do just due to people being out and some of the factors with air quality and things like that that popped up. But taking some of the opportunities that we had and trying to do things like burn campgrounds. We had a brief window when all the state parks were closed. So we really went in there and tried to, clean up areas, some of them which had no fire history or had been 10 years for. So we went in and, tried to treat some of the things that we had an opportunity when there wasn't public, when there wasn't a staff there that, we would be exposing to smoke in some of our parks and do some treatments in there. So that was another strategy that we did have some success with, which was kind of nice. But overall, it's pretty similar amongst all the other answers. We just tried to grab what we could and keep everybody safe. And like Brett said, reassure that culture of, hey, we got to take care of ourselves and make sure that everybody's doing the right thing so we can keep doing what we can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It does make me wonder, across any of you, were there any specific tools or resources that you used this year that maybe something for smoke management or smoke planning or anything else that came to mind that you hadn't used before in managing your fire programs? At this point, just kind of speak up if you would like to.
Yeah, David, I'd say it kind of happened at the same time as the state of Florida or Florida Forest Service started using the air quality index, but we started looking at air quality index on a more regular basis, both for burn planning, but thinking about smoke management and those impacts to the community. But for me, there's a ton of great tools out there. There's the IRPG COVID checklist. There's NIFC and Southern Fire Exchange have a bunch of things, but probably the most valuable have been stories and lessons learned from either out west or the spring fire season in Florida. I think somebody from the Jackson Hot Shots wrote a whole kind of report on their experience, but I learned a ton just by word of mouth, by folks going out on details, coming back with ideas and so forth.
One thing we took advantage of was use of our partners, and we have some really great partnerships and this has always been going on in the past, but I think we leaned even more heavily on them this year because we could use them as modules. The module of one concept, we had Nature Conservancy, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, we had Air Force crews from Tyndall come over, thank you, Brett. And they could work as a small module within our larger burn units and work as divisions. This module takes this side of the fire, this module takes that side of the fire. And we could sort of social distance on these larger burns within these modules, but really relying on our partners was very helpful, which we've always done before, but they were more integrated in the past. This year, they may have been more separated in that social isolation concept.
All right, so looking ahead, oh, sorry, Sasha, I didn't give you a chance to respond to that one. Did you have any tools that you wanted to highlight?
I guess Brett brought it up, but being familiar with the AQI, Florida has the new system that's through airnow.gov, and just being familiar with that and really kind of looking at those forecasts and seeing where there might be issues and trying to avoid putting your planning efforts to where you're not going to be able to burn. So that's one. And then windy.com is actually another one that allowed us to look a little further out at some of the airflow systems, up to, I think it's 10 days on there now. So that was a tool that became very critical, especially when we were in the thick of the beginning of it. And we were starting to get some limitations due to air quality index, especially around our urban areas. But the other one for us in our program was kind of embracing some of the technology. I think firefighters on the ground, sometimes we are reluctant to do that, or we like to see how it works first. And some of the things like QR codes for briefings and being able to do some of our planning meetings, like we're doing right now in a virtual meeting rather than at a, in-person conference where we're all talking about this stuff, but just using some of those tools. And myself, I've overcome some of my fear of technology just because of being forced to do that. And things like not sharing paper at a briefing, where you can just grab everything on your phone, does limit some of the exposure. So some of those little things, have been good learning opportunities as well.
All right, thank you all. And so kind of looking ahead, how might 2020's impacts on prescribed fire cascade to your 2021 prescribed fire planning? We started this discussion planning for this webinar, like Morgan said earlier, last year, and now we're already into 2021, and we're still in it, and we're still dealing with it. So, looking forward, how is this cascading into your prescribed fire programs? And Sasha, I'm going to go back to you on this one.
So, a lot of the success stories and just strategies that both Greg and Brett have shared are what we're looking at. We're looking at kind of pulling larger units together, building on our successes, where we have good blacks still that we can push into from the previous years. It's kind of hard to isolate it as a one-year phenomenon like was brought up earlier, but taking advantage of the wins we've already had and utilizing those to help grab good windows and be able to burn where we can is definitely a big part of it. But there's one thing that I do have some concerns about when it comes to success, and that's we're still having people who are out in quarantine for COVID, and the impact on the field staff that is trying to still accomplish more with less. And so far we do it, we've got a ranger first attitude, get things done, but there is some concern about just at what point you can keep carrying this forward. So I think the success really relies on all the people on the ground and just, utilizing some of these strategies that we're all trying to use. But it's definitely the impact of it. I'm concerned about the long-term impact, the deficit to the, ecology as well for what we didn't get burned. But that, a year out of rotation is not that big of a deal. But the impact long-term on just, people are going to need a break, and going into a possible another drought, it's always a challenge to try and hit those windows right on the edge between switching from burning to chasing them. So yeah, that's my concern.
Yeah. Greg, you want to tie into that?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Sasha just said. Our firefighter health is primary concern, just from a personal relationship with those folks, but also from our productivity. We have a pretty small staff. So when one person's out, it's a huge impact on our program. And then we don't want that to cascade into our partners that come to help. We want to keep them as safe as possible also. And then like Sasha and Brett have both talked about, the change in our rotation, we're going to have, we have this backlog that we'll have to catch up on. So we will have to use some different strategies in the future to make up on that backlog. And that's going to be primarily in our dormant season burning, because as the roughs get heavier, we can't, do these growing season burns on them. And it seems as though our dormant season windows are shorter and smaller. Like it's been raining here for the last week, and there's another week of rain predicted. So these backlogs of dormant season are going to be hard to catch up on, I believe.
All right, Brett, you want to?
Yeah, and just to speak to the kind of firefighter safety and employee safety part of it, I have one big concern is the human factor part of it. There's a lot of stress. Either I'm going to get COVID, or I know somebody that got COVID. There's isolation, and just the stress levels up. And so I worry about the kind of cumulative effects and the impacts on situational awareness. So I think everybody needs to be extra safe. Don't take those chances, and kind of keep an eye on your crew and your crewmates. As far as it's a lot of the similar strategies, but we're really prioritizing burning heavier roughs. Kind of speaking to what Greg's saying, trying to focus on fuels management to buy us long-term insurance policy. If we can keep the fuels managed, then we can weather the storm better. We rely a lot, like Greg and Sasha have mentioned, on local partnerships. We haven't been using as many outside detailers, so those local partnerships, local agreements are really paying off right now. To speak to smoke management, I think we're using the same idea of bigger blocks, go big when you can, but I think we have to temper that with on the right day, because if we do start causing smoke impacts as a prescribed fire community, we may start getting either permits not available, or may start getting forced into no burn days. So we need to use best management practices on our smoke management. And yeah, last year I looked at the numbers at Eglin. In January last year, our average burn size was 630 acres. This past January was 1,700 acres. So we've tripled our burn size. That was just 1 month, but only data I have.
I think Greg touched on something that came up in some conversations that we had with Ben and Morgan in planning this, and that, you know, it's the reality of burning in the Southeast, it seems, is that the more you burn, the easier it gets, right? So the more entries, the better, the higher the fire frequency, the easier it is to burn the site, and the wider the window of fuel and meteorological conditions you have to go back and burn that site again. And so when sites get out of rotation, so to speak, kind of like Greg said, you have to start reverting to maybe burning during the dormant season, when conditions might be a little more, conservative, so to speak. But so these events, like we're seeing with the impacts that Ben has documented, may have cascading effects that will impact fire management programs for multiple years, even just on the ecological conditions. At least that seems to be my take on it. So I guess looking forward even further down the road, someday we will be, I suspect, optimistically post-pandemic, right? So, if you're looking down the road, we work in natural resource management. We're all pretty much optimistic some way or another. How, do you get a sense that there are already things that you have learned over the past year in managing a fire or managing your burn crews and programs that you think you will take into your fire management programs post-pandemic, so to speak? And Greg, I've got you up first on that one.
I can think of three things real briefly that I think are really critical for us going into the future. And that's planning with our partners, planning ahead with our partners. We have partners with adjacent land masses. So planning with them and burning strategically so we can incorporate, into a single burn, our property and their property together. So that strategic planning and keeping a good rotation, like you just mentioned, David, it allows us a greater flexibility when we do get into tougher times. That with a lighter rough, it is easier to burn. So the more you burn, the easier it is to burn, as we say. And then we're fortunate here. We're along the Gulf Coast. We're in a fairly rural environment, so we can go big on days when we have the right weather, because our smoke management, the smoke is going out over the Gulf. So we can really, here locally at St. Mark's, we can take advantage of that and go for those big block days. Not everyone can do that, but we're fortunate enough here to be able to do that. So we try to take advantage of it when we have the correct parameters.
Yeah, Brett, do you want to add to that in terms of, looking post-pandemic, your thoughts and lessons learned, perhaps?
Yeah, kind of zooming out to the 30,000 foot level. I mean, the pandemic is just another on a long list of factors that are stacked up against burners, whether it's climate change or weather changes and weather anomalies, changes to policy that make it harder to get the burning done, changes to air quality standards, staffing levels, funding, all of this. So I think it all just hits home to me. We've got to be as aggressive as possible with prescribed fire. We need to be burning as every window we can get, because that is our insurance policy against these perturbations or disturbances in the regime. So at Eglin, we've been able to burn 90,000 acres per year for a long, or at least 5 to 10 years. So this hasn't been a big hit yet on our landscape. Kind of like Greg said, he had a lot already in management or fuels under management, and so it's making it easier to weather this storm. But I think we could have more rolling pandemics into the future, unfortunately. So we just need to learn how to live with it and adapt to it, and don't stop if you hit your targets. Just keep burning.
All right, thanks. And Sasha, you want to share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think Brett, summed it up really good, and Greg had a lot of the same things I would say as well. But resilience, kind of as a buzzword, is like we're always, adapt and overcome, but we have to be ready to embrace things like this, new challenges that we've never really considered as a part of what we're doing. And so, having seen some of this stuff, I feel like, whether the pandemic continues in the way it is now with the same protocols, or starts to go away or increases, we at least are familiar with some of what our challenges will be in situations like this. So just the resilience to keep going and adapting, and not get, hung up by the new challenges, because whether it's air quality or social distancing, there's always going to be something new, or changing ecotones due to sea level rise, whatever it is, we're going to have challenges, but we have the strength and the, things like this where we get together and talk about how to meet those challenges. I think that's a real big way for us to succeed moving forward. So yeah, just keep going after it. As every acre we treat is one more that's ready to be ready next time.
All right. Well, I appreciate all three of you for those thoughts. I want to provide some time to get to questions that have come in from the audience. So at this point, if you're joining us on the webinar, we do want to provide the opportunity for you to ask questions. Some folks have already done so in the Q&A tool. So please type if your comments or questions for our speakers in the Q&A window. If you see some other comments or questions that you would like us to prioritize, give it the thumbs up, and we'll use that to ask our speakers. So, here's something that we haven't covered today, and it comes in from Joe. And Joe says, not only has prescribed fire been negatively impacted, says Joe, but so has prescribed fire outreach. And he gives example of a fire festival for 2021 that was canceled due to COVID. So from your programs in your shops, could you talk about, has your outreach programs as it relates to prescribed fire been impacted over the last year?
Well, I'll jump in. Here at St. Mark's, we have two large festivals each year. We have the Monarch Butterfly Festival, and we have the Wildlife Heritage and Outdoors Festival, one in the spring and one in the fall. And both of those, we did not have those this year. And those are tremendous outreach opportunities for our fire crew. We usually staff a booth there and reach hundreds, if not thousands of people on each day of those festivals. So we missed those opportunities just because of the pandemic this year.
So we had a question that came in from Carolyn. It is interesting. Carolyn asks if burn managers or anybody on your crews who have contracted COVID, are they hesitant to return to the work environment, to working around smoke due to long-term impacts of having COVID? So do you guys have any experience with individuals in any of your crews having come down with COVID and then dealing with that in a professional environment afterwards?
Yeah, David, we had one crew member contract COVID. That person was young, had no major complications from it, so it wasn't an issue in that case and didn't seem to be a concern. But I think on a case-by-case basis, and maybe we need to be doing more evaluation, post-COVID evaluation before we put them back on the line. But so far, it's just been case-by-case and hasn't been a big issue. But I definitely see the concern and have the concern myself.
Yeah, we have one individual who is home on quarantine right now and will be back next week sometime. And all conversations I've had with them is that it's been mild symptoms and they're raring to go again. But again, like Brett said, we don't really know the long-term effects, that could show up, months down the road.
So here's another question related to that. That came in from David, and David asked, how do you deal with an exposure once it affects one of your fire crews? Brett, I think you talked a little bit about your team working in pods, kind of dealing with rotations. Could any of you guys talk about your experiences with that and maybe share some of that?
I don't mind going first again. Everything goes through our Air Force Public Health, so actually I have a pretty good resource to guide me through it. But it's everything you do outside of work. It's contact tracing. It's looking back at who the individual had contact with, and yeah, all the normal quarantine or self-isolation, and yeah, it's pretty much what you do in any situation, I think, but I can't think of anything fire specific on that one.
All right, Sasha or Greg, did y'all have any experience to share on that one?
No, I guess the biggest thing is kind of like Brett was saying, it's pretty cut and dry for us. We follow the guidelines that have been put forth by the agency on that. So, there's not much we can do about it, whether someone's symptomatic or asymptomatic. They have to do the quarantine for 10 days, 24 hours past fever kind of thing. And, that can impact. And if you have an exposure and you're trying to wait, especially if it gets into one of your crews, that can affect a large group of people or a significant group of people in a very short order. But fortunately, the guidelines are there, and so far we haven't had to deal with it too much.
It's the same here. We follow the guidelines, and we have folks on quarantine when there's been a primary exposure, especially, or if they actually contracted it, then we just follow the protocols.
I do want to say, David, that it's been challenging in that there hasn't been consistency across the federal agencies, within federal agencies, state to federal on guidance and protocols and so forth. And so it really came to life this summer. We had a couple mutual aid fires that on Eglin that volunteer fire departments, others came to, and it was across the board. Some didn't wear masks at all. Some wore masks, sort of. I had the first fire I came up to, they came right up into my face without a mask on, and you just be prepared for anything, expect the unexpected, but that interoperability has become more challenging, I feel like, because we're all operating on different sets of rules, unfortunately.
That is a good point. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you all so much, Sasha, Greg, and Brett. We certainly appreciate your responses and your experience in managing your fire programs over the past year and sharing that with our audience today. Your email addresses are on the screen, and I'll bring them up again in just a moment. And so if anyone else has any questions, they can contact you. I would like to say, Morgan mentioned this at the beginning of our program today. Do you have a story to share on how COVID-19 has impacted your prescribed fire and wildland fire management programs? We'd like to know. And if you would like to share your story, you can give us an email there at fireresearch@talltimbers.org. And the folks on this webinar today, the planning team, we are looking at ways to share success stories related to managing fire during the pandemic, and to then use some of those stories and that information to improve future fire science and research projects. So if you would like to share that, your experience over the past year, please consider reaching out and letting the team know. So in respect for everyone's time, it looks like we've run up to the end of our program today. If you would like to follow up with our speakers and panelists, please see their contact information on the screen. Ben, Morgan, Sasha, Greg, and Brett, thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. I've enjoyed working with you on this, and thank you for your partnership in making this webinar happen. And thank you everyone who joined, who asked questions, who shared your thoughts and comments, and who said howdy on the chat window and all those things. We really appreciate it, and these kinds of things are really fun. So thank you all, everybody, and have a good afternoon.